Good morning, students. Our topic for today is change management. Now, this is a slightly technical topic. This covers elements around E2 as well as E3. So, listen very carefully. I'll try to put it kind of very simply. I'll use some examples also so that you understand it better. So, let's look at what is change management. Now, if you remember the strategic planning process, we spoke about the different stages, and the two most important stages we spoke about was the strategic choice and the strategic implementation. Now, when we look at strategic choice, we spoke about the Boston Consulting Group matrix, which was talking about the product portfolio. We spoke about the Ansoff matrix, which was primarily focusing around the product and the market. So when do we develop a product? When do we develop a market? When do we kind of penetrate into an existing market? So that was around Ansoff. The third strategic choice, which is generally not a choice, because when you talk of products, when you talk of markets, pricing actually comes into play. So the third strategic choice that we had was around the Porter's generic strategies. So ideally any company would have at any point in time these three strategic choices, and it is up to the company, depending on where they are, what they want to achieve, what is their vision, what is their mission statement. They'll make a choice in terms of whether I go for one, whether I go for two, whether I go for all of them. Now, having said that, I made a strategic choice, but is that strategic choice good enough? Now, when I say good enough, the definition is that strategic choice good enough to be sustained in the long run? Now, before we kind of implement our strategic choice, there is two elements that we need to consider. Now, one is we'll talk about change management, because when you're making a choice and you're trying to implement, it will be a major shift in focus. It will be something different that you're trying to do, and it will have a material impact. Now, when I say material impact, the material impact will be on the vision and mission statement of the organization. How do we achieve that? Now, strategic choice, and before it gets implemented, has to pass through a litmus test. Now, litmus test is something that we at KAPP have kind of coined. Now, litmus test is something that we've read about when we were kind of studying science. But why do we say litmus test? Is because it has three components here. The first component being suitability. It has second component, which is acceptability, and third is the feasibility. Now, for any strategic choice to get implemented, it has to pass through the litmus test. Now, when we say litmus test and we talk about suitability, so when does a strategic choice become suitable? When I get information that yes, it will help me achieve my mission statement. So if it is aligned to your mission statement, if it will help the organization to achieve the mission statement, it becomes suitable. So my first level of suitability has been managed. Now, the second element is acceptability. Now, acceptability for any strategic choice which helps you manage your mission statement comes from your stakeholders. So, if you remember, we did this Mendelow's power interest matrix in a separate lecture. Now, Mendelow's power interest matrix 1 helped us to plot our stakeholders. And when we have an understanding of our stakeholders, it is easier for us to go talk to them, get their acceptability. Now, keep in mind, if you have a strategic choice that you're trying to implement, unless you have the blessings of your stakeholders, unless you have the buy-in from your stakeholders, it might become difficult for you to implement. So, after suitability comes acceptability. So, if you get acceptability from shareholders, level 2 pass. Now, the last element is feasibility. The strategic choice may be good for a mission statement, may be likable by the stakeholders, but do we have the capability, do we have the feasibility to implement the strategic choice? Now, strategic choice implementation comes through a check on our feasibility. Now, feasibility in our corporate language will refer to as strategic capability. Now, if you remember, we did again another framework which was called as the resource competency grid. Now, the resource competency grid tells us our strategic capability to implement the strategic choice to be able to achieve our mission statement. So, if you have a tick box, if you have a checkbox against suitability, if you have acceptability, and if you have a feasibility, that is when you say that yes, I am making the right strategic choice and it will be sustainable over a period of time. Now, when you have passed the litmus test, that is when you have confidence that yes, the strategic choice is right, and you start moving towards implementation. Now, there are no specific frameworks that we have in terms of how do we implement it, but the bottom line is effective implementation is what will give you results. Now, effective implementation of a strategic choice will require that you have a very strong change management process in the organization. Now, seldom change management process in every organization is different depending on the type of organization. Now, if you remember some of our previous lectures wherein we spoke about a learning organization, we spoke about an innovation company, we spoke about an organization which thrives on chaos. Now, change management is different in every organization depending on what is the kind of organization, what is the maturity of the organization, what is sometimes the management philosophy around change. Right now, for a learning organization, change management might be a very slow process because they learn with experience, they move slowly, they don't tend to kind of drive the market, they're driven by market. So change management is not very difficult, but it is relatively slow. Now, for an innovation company where people understand the importance of change management becomes relatively simple. Now, in our lecture today, we look at the different elements of change management process. Now, the entire change management process, I've divided it into 4 steps. Step number 1 being what are the triggers of change. So, if I identify the triggers of change, I understand what is driving the change. It could be good, it could be bad. The second element is resistance to change. Resistance to change, so triggers of change, resistance to change, and then we come to two frameworks. Both these frameworks are given by a person called Kurt Lewin. So one is force field analysis, so I'll talk about it. It is not very difficult to understand. And then we look at the 3-step change management process. Now, just keep in mind that this does not follow any particular order. So when I say it doesn't mean that first I have to identify this, then I go to this, and finally I go to the 3-step change management process. For me to facilitate the process better, I first need to understand the triggers of change. Now, what triggers of change is the driving force. What is trying to get us to make a change? It could be an internal trigger, it could be an external trigger. Now, we've all looked at some of the external triggers, so I'll just do a recap. So, PESTEL analysis or PESTEL framework gives you some of the external triggers. It could be a change that you want to implement because of a change in technology. It could be because of some legal regulations which have changed. It could be because of political scenario. So PESTEL framework will tell you some of the triggers which would warrant you to kind of make or do something different, and that doing different would require you to invoke change management. Now, after PESTEL, you have another framework which is called as the Porter's 5 forces. Now, again, Porter's 5 forces, PESTEL, both are external, both give you the same kind of information. PESTEL is a little broad focused. Porter's 5 forces is a little narrow focus because it is only looking at market, it is only looking at competitors. It may not cover elements such as the social factors. It may sometimes not look at the legal component, but yes, when an organization looks at the external triggers of change, it tends to do an analysis around both the elements. Now, when we look at internal triggers of change, it could be a change in the vision statement, because vision statement is just for the foreseeable future. So let's say 3 to 5 years an organization has been functioning and it wants to kind of change the vision statement. Now, why would an organization change a vision statement? Because one, they want to fast track the way they achieve the mission statement. Second is they might feel that the vision statement is slightly outdated. The mission statement is always cast in stone, it never changes. But for you to achieve a mission statement, your vision statement might require some kind of tweakings. It could be because of external elements, it could be because of internal elements, it could be because of a combination of both. So internal factors could be a change in management philosophy, so your top management changes. Now their approach to achieving mission statement might be different from their predecessors. So this might warrant a change, and these could become some of the triggers of change. Now, if you notice here, I put SWOT right at the center of internal and external. So I'll just recapitulate for yourself. Now, S and W, the strengths and weakness, are internal to an organization. They are the as is strengths and as is weakness of an organization. The second OT, the opportunities and threats, are external to an organization. Now they could be coming in from their competitors, they could be coming in from the market, they could be coming from the customers, they could be coming in from the way the industry is progressing. So SWOT, any triggers coming from SWOT, it will be having a component of internal as well as external. So now, first element of change management is let me understand the triggers of change. Now when I say let me understand, I'm basically talking about the management to understand. If the management understand this component well, that is when they will be able to take it forward to employees. Right? Now the next and the most interesting part of change management is a word that always comes to our mind when we talk of change, and that word is resistance to change. Now, I am sure that many of you might have been part of the change management journey in your organization. And when we talk of change management, the first element that comes to my mind is somebody will go and resist. Now, not everybody accepts change in the right spirit at the first moment. They might accept it later, but initially there is some hesitance, there is some resistance to change. Now, why is there a resistance to change? Why at the first position people resist? Now, what has been understood is that there are generally three factors because of which there could be any kind of resistance. The first is job factor. Now let's say we're implementing a new technology in an organization, and today the organization works on a manual method. Now when you work in a manual method, you tend to employ, let's say, 100 people. Now when you bring in change or when you bring in new technology, now you may not need 100 people. You will need about, let's say, 70 people, let's say about 60 people. Now if you need about 70 people, 30 people in the organization currently working become redundant. Now whenever there is any change which impacts your job, you tend to resist particular change. Now we're not saying that those 30 people will be thrown out of the organization, but they could be redeployed into an organization, and redeployment can take some time. Now redeployment is something that people will have to understand. Unless and until they don't get an assurance, unless and until they don't understand, because it is impacting their job, they will resist that particular change, they will not like it. Now the second element is job social factor. Now let's say there is no danger on my job, I will not be losing my job because of the change that is being implemented, but I am part of a social group, I am part of a society which is not liking the change. So there is a tendency for me to kind of support the society and also say that because the society is not liking the change, there might be something in it which I am not currently understanding. So I tend to join the bandwagon and I say that okay, yes, because of social factors, I am not in for the change. So those could be some of the social factors. Now personal factor. Now let's say I act as a change agent. Now when we do change management, there is a person who's called as a change agent. Now these people could be internal, these people could be external, depending on what is the kind of change and what is that we're trying to do and what is the time that is available to us. Sometimes people inside the organization are able to implement change. Sometimes you need people from the external world to kind of come into your organization, bring in a neutral view, and then kind of do that particular change. So sometimes what happens is people have a dislike for the person, for the change agent who's trying to implement change. Now because they have a dislike, that becomes one of the personal factors why I will resist change. So far what we've looked at is we've looked at the triggers of change, the internal and external, and because of these triggers of change there is also some kind of resistance because we're trying to implement change. Now once we've understood these two components, now let us look at the process through which we will manage the resistance to change. Now Kurt Lewin gave us a framework which he called as the force field analysis. Now force field analysis basically comprises of two components, the driving forces and the restraining forces. Now let me help you understand what are the driving forces and what are the restraining forces. Now if you look at the board, so I'll slightly move away. So if you look at the board, when you say talk about triggers of change, the internal and the external, by nature this is something that the organization has to understand, and these are something that if an organization implements, it will bring a positive change to them in terms of achieving their vision statement, in terms of achieving their mission statement. Now let me give you an example, the smartphone industry. So all of us use smartphones. Now what happened to Nokia? Nokia was at one point in time the market leader in mobile phones, but they were not kind of keeping pace with the change in technology. So smartphones were evolving, but Nokia was still stuck onto their old phones, and because they were market leaders, they kind of got onto their heads that okay, we are market leaders, will remain market leaders, this change is a slow change, it will take time, and slowly and steadily we'll adapt to that particular change. Now what happened during the course was that the smartphone technology kind of overtook Nokia in such high speed, and the impact was so big that Nokia finally had to start adapting very fast to bring in smartphone. But the sad part was that it was a bit too late. Now that is, there were triggers of change, they were happening through Fortis 5 forces, they were being identified through Pestle, but maybe Nokia did not do a good analysis of it, and that is why they were immune to a change which was happening right around them. And the result we all know, Nokia today is almost out of market, and there are new players who kind of captured what Nokia had in terms of a market share. So there were triggers of change, there were traces of triggers of change, there were hints of triggers of change. Unfortunately, nobody kind of took it seriously, and that is why they were not able to do an effective change management also. Now let's look at another example. A classical example of again a similar situation wherein organizations did not understand the triggers of change was the example of Honda. Now, at a point in time, Honda had a mindset that we have models like the Accord, the Civic, the City, which are high selling, all of them kind of are cash cows, and then we are market leaders. So, why are we kind of impacted by any kind of change? So, they were market leaders, they were building models, so they had this psychology that we will not change our model design, like let's say in 5 years, we'll only sell petrol cars, will not sell diesel cars. But with the advent of Volkswagen, the Vento, the City was in for a very tough competition. So Vento came in, it was sturdy, it was an equivalent to the Honda City, it was adequately priced. They came up with an interesting financing option. So that was one point in time when Honda started to feel the heat. And I still remember that Honda historically has never given any discount on their cars. They've never changed their designs, they've never introduced cars in about less than 3 to 4 years. They've always been petrol. But if you look at this particular element for Honda, they were triggers of change. Maybe they knew about it, they did not do anything about it. So what happened was at one point in time, City kind of was dethroned from being a market leader and Vento kind of took its place. There were other models coming in, and if you look at today, so the CRV is out of business, the Accord is no longer being manufactured, and the City is being upgraded almost 6 months to an year. So that is where Honda kind of understood that yes, we need to constantly change. Now today if you look at Honda, they make petrol cars, they make diesel cars, they've got new variants, they've got new models, and because they were not as late as Nokia, they've regained their market share. Maybe they've lost quite a bit, but even then they're still in a very healthy position. So that is what is the importance for us to kind of understand the need for change, because if you make the right strategic choice, if it passes the litmus test, effective change management is required, and for effective change management you need to understand the triggers for change. Now let's come back to the force field analysis. Now when we look at the triggers for change, these are positive forces which make organizations change. These are forces which warrant an organization to adapt to the changing needs, to the changing environment in which it operates, because the environment will continuously keep evolving, right? Now, triggers of change are directly impacted or directly plotted as the driving forces. So, if you look at the force field analysis framework, there are two sets of forces: the driving forces. For sake of simplicity, I put them as these are positive forces. These will support change, so they will facilitate change to happen. They will be that okay, yes, because of these forces we should be changing, and there will be a positive impact to the organization. Now restraining forces are negative, they're opposite of driving forces, they're negative, they will go against change, so they will make change difficult. Now if you look at this board, it is very simple. I will put it very simplistically. Triggers of change is something that acts as driving forces for an organization. They are positive, they support change, they want change to happen, and that is what an organization needs to understand. Now resistance to change, by the so resistance in its sense is very negative. So resistance to change and the different resistance to change factors, the job factor, the social factor, the personal factors, these are what again classified as restraining forces. So they will be negative in nature because it is a resistance, and second, these are the factors that will go against the change being implemented. Now, when an organization understands the triggers for change, the resistance to change, and now they've done a plotting. So the force field analysis is more of a plotting. So I plot all my driving forces, I plot all my restraining forces, and then I kind of sit back and have a look at it. What is the end result? Now what happens is, if you have more driving forces and less restraining forces, that's good, because you have more positive elements, you have less negative elements. So it is easier, it is relatively easier for organizations to implement change. Now let's say you have an equal element of driving forces and equal element of restraining forces. So generally organizations will have three strategies that they can kind of implement. The first is you only look at how do I increase the force of my driving forces. So if you increase this, make them stronger, they will become relatively weak and you will be able to implement change. So that's the first strategy, increase the strength of your driving forces. Now the second strategy is reduce the strength of your restraining forces. So if you make them weak, they become relatively strong, and that is when you can implement change. Now the third strategy is, rather than focusing only on driving forces, rather than focusing only on the restraining forces, I look at How do I make them strong? How do I make them weak? Now, when I say making them weak, it is basically going out to people who are resisting change and helping them understand the need for change, the benefits for them, the benefits for the organization, and obtaining a buy-in. Now keep in mind, resistance to change will generally come from employees or employee related factors. Like for example, it could be an individual employee, it could be a department, it could be a team, it could be a trade union. Now, if you look at resistance to change, it comes in from employees and related employee factors. Now, employees, when we look at the Mendelow's power interest matrix, was one of the stakeholders. Now, employees in their individual capacity. So, just kind of recapitulating for you the Mendelow's power interest matrix. So, the power interest matrix was focusing on two elements: level of power and level of influence. Now, an individual employee will have a high level of interest, but he may not have that high level of power. But when we talk of a trade union, they may have high level of interest and high level of power, right? So it's primarily a difference between a key player and a keep informed kind of stakeholder on the power interest grid. So if you're able to understand, so these become my stakeholders. Now for me to implement strategy, I need to have stakeholder buy-in. So when I say that I want to reduce the restraining forces, I'm trying to say that we need to help people understand what is that the change brings for them in terms of positive elements, what is that the change brings for the company, because company performance impact employees. So once that kind of information is given to employees, it is very likely that the restraining forces will go down. People from this quadrant will transition to the driving forces quadrant, because they will now become pro change. Rather than being anti change, they will become pro change, and when they become pro change, it is in the interest of the organization. Right? Now there could be a point that people are not willing to change and then the organization wants to use power and coercion. But the danger of that is, if you use too much of power, if you use too much of coercion, if you don't get in buy-in from people who are resisting change, the change may not be sustainable. And it is our intent that anything that we do becomes sustainable for an organization, because you can't be implementing, you can't be changing every day, because these are big ticket changes, these are high impact changes, and if anything goes wrong, it can impact the mission of the organization, the vision of the organization. So force field analysis: plot your driving forces, plot your restraining forces, try to increase their force, try to reduce their force, or try to manage both of them in a manner that overall there is positivity and overall the change can be implemented. Now when we understand our driving forces and restraining forces, the same person, Kurt Lewin, also gave us another framework which we call as the three-step change management process. Now it is not relevant whether this has to be done first or this has to be done after. Both these can be done parallelly. Now when we say the three-step change management process, let us quickly understand it. So the first step is called the unfreeze. Now this is a stage where you kind of create some discomfort within the organization, some discomfort within the employees, so that they start understanding the need for change. Because if everything goes status quo, then people will not understand the need for change, people will not understand the triggers for change, and then that is when they will not implement change and the organization might look at a difficult period. So the first is creating discomfort, creating the need for change, creating the need for understanding the change within the organization, within the employees. Once they start understanding, that is when we bring in a change. So I'll share an example also. Now when we create a discomfort, that is when we look at implementing the change. Now once change has been implemented, you as an organization should go and refreeze. Now refreeze is that whatever new you have implemented in terms of change should be frozen, so that people, if they find it difficult to adapt to change, if they find it difficult to cope up with the change, because see, whenever you implement change, there will be some time period required for people to adjust to that change. Now it is very likely when during that adjustment period, if people find it difficult to adjust, they might want to come back to older ways of working. Now let me take an example here. So let's say you are an organization and you're working on Tally. So Tally is a software that allows you to it's like a simplified ERP software. So if you kind of use it, so people you are used to Tally, but the cost of, or you may need more people, and it may not be very effective and efficient system. So let's say the organization takes a decision in terms of change management that you want to implement SAP. Now SAP is an ERP solution which has different modules to it. Once everything is implemented, it brings a lot of efficiency and effectiveness to an organization. Now when we look at the three-step management process relating to Tally being replaced by SAP. So first the organization tries to circulate within its own community. Why do we need SAP? What are the negatives of Tally? What are the benefits that SAP will bring in? So that is where the organization kind of creates a discomfort that okay, yes, we need to understand that SAP is better. Now when people start to understand, and while we are also working on the driving and restraining forces, the organization tends to bring in SAP. Now SAP cannot be implemented in a single day. There is a journey. So you work on implementing SAP, but while you implement SAP, Tally also kind of works. So there is a parallel being drawn that SAP will work, Tally will work, and both of them will work simultaneously. So that when you transition data from Tally to SAP, and if you get a comfort that SAP is also giving us the right results, that is when you take a decision that I need to refreeze. Now, when I say refreeze, it means that I will take away Tally completely out of my organization and I will only rely on SAP. Now, how will I do that? I will stop the support for Tally. I will not upgrade the versions of Tally, and I will discourage people from using Tally. So people will take about 6 months, 8 months to a year to understand SAP. Now during that 6 to 8 months to 12 months, some people might say that SAP is difficult, let me go back to Tally. But that is what the organization has intelligently done. Once it has implemented SAP, it has given time to employees to adjust, to adapt, but it is not allowing people to accept or work on Tally as a software. So over a period of time, people will get accustomed to SAP, people will find SAP easier, and organization will try and get the benefits of that particular change. Now people who accept change, though it is not there on the board, but people who accept change, there is a general tendency in an organization that if I as an individual accept change, I will get rewarded. So what will happen? It will have a psychological impact. I am accepting change, I am being rewarded, so my friends will feel that okay, he's accepting change. Why is he accepting change? So I might become a change agent, I might become a brand ambassador, that okay, because of this I've accepted change and I've been rewarded. So the impact of that will be people who are part of social groups, people who are job fears, people who have personal factor resistance to change, they will start transitioning from the restraining forces to the driving forces. Overall, the journey of the organization will become relatively simple. So the change management process is starting from identification of triggers of change to ultimately following a three-step change management process to implementing change within an organization. So that is what I had to kind of talk to you about change management. I hope it was useful, I hope it was simple, and I hope that you now understood what are the different components, why is it so important, what is the relevance of a litmus test, and if you are very clear on the litmus test and if you do effective change management, that is when the strategic implementation becomes very effective, and the end result of this will be that the organization will be able to achieve their mission statement, the vision statement, and their particular goals. So thank you so much for being part of this change management process. I hope everyone liked it.